Welcome to FreedomLovin.com, where we focus on building freedom in an unfree world. Through personal development, location independence, and passive income strategies. Now here's your host, Kevin Koskela.
Welcome back to another episode of the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. This is Kevin, and this is episode number 88. And today, in just a minute, I have an interview coming up with my friend Bertrand of Complete Liberty, and he's going to talk about his new book, or his new-ish book, Complete Liberty Inside Out. It was a great discussion. Make sure you don't miss it. It's an hour long, but totally worth it. So you'll get some nuggets of wisdom from Wes for sure. And if you are doing business online right now and you don't know much about how to protect your assets, consider a New Mexico LLC. And that's something that I use for my online businesses as well as I was using it for my real estate holdings. And that's something where you can actually be invisible and anonymous in your business. So check it out. I have a URL where I go into detail about what I've done with the New Mexico LLCs and also how you can purchase one. And it's at freedomlovin.com/LLC. That's freedomlovin.com/LLC. Just a few topics before we go to the interview. I was thinking about this idea of digital nomadism and perpetual travel or permanent tourism or a PT lifestyle. You hear those things a lot. And a lot of people get a little bit confused because they think of these young 20-somethings bouncing around the world and working on their laptops and, from all these exotic locations. But it doesn't always have to be that. And there definitely are a lot of people doing that, but there's a lot of people that are quite a bit older and actually are perpetual travelers, and they are digital nomads. But there's all different ages. There's also people that don't move around much. Like they're in one place most of the time, but yet they are free, and that's the key. They are free to travel, free to work from anywhere. So if they do want to, they can go somewhere else to work, but they choose not to. So I want to say that there's not much of a distinction there. The most important thing is to set yourself up with this freedom lifestyle rather than to get picky about like, oh, I need to be traveling or I can't just stay in one place. Because I've heard that on other podcasts before about how people say, oh, I'm a digital nomad or I'm a PT, but then that person stays in the same place for 6 months or a year or something. And that's okay. That's totally okay. You can do that. It's your choice. And if you like where you are, you just don't want to travel. But you want the freedom. It's still totally worth it to adopt this kind of lifestyle. It's having the options that matters. That's all I wanted to say about that. I just hear there's some confusion about like whether you have to be traveling if you are a PT or if you can actually stay in one place, even in good old America. So let's see. I got my blood readings today, actually. I met with my naturopathic doctor, and we're going to really quickly say that everything was pretty much excellent. It looks like I need to be drinking more water, causing a couple little small things to go into the orange zone. It was green, orange, red, and orange means that there could be a problem later, but it doesn't mean that there's anything really seriously wrong yet. So, my vitamin D levels are too high. So that was kind of surprising because I always think that I have low vitamin D because I spend a lot of time indoors, but I do live in San Diego where it is sunny most of the time. And so when you go outside, I try to go for walks every day or almost every day. When you go outside, it is quite nice in the middle of the day and you can get some of that vitamin D production. And so I've been doing that. Plus I've been supplementing with about 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. So with all that, I probably am just overdoing it. So the only recommendation there is to just not take vitamin D for a while and just keep getting the natural sunlight. But looks like she had some great ideas on some of my shoulder issues and some of the supplements that I could take that, could be affecting things that I'm lacking that are going on. And I can get into more detail on this, but I don't want to spend this episode on it because we've got a lot to cover and with the interview with Wes. So that's about it. So we got a Facebook group. If you are on Facebook, then look us up. It's facebook.com/groups/freedomlovinquest. So look us up there and request to join if you are interested, and ask any questions, introduce yourself. I love the idea of having a group and being able to chat about travel or freedom, business, whatever you want to talk about. I think it'd be awesome. So without further ado, here's my interview with Wes Bertrand. Go out there and build some freedom, and we'll talk to you soon. All right. Well, I am happy to have back on the show my good friend Wes Bertrand, who is the author of the book Complete Liberty, and also wrote a book called The Psychology of Liberty. And he has a more recent book that is called Complete Liberty Inside Out that came out, I think, about 5 or 6 months ago. He has many episodes of the Complete Liberty podcast still up, and then he runs a site called Happiness Counseling. And we also did a show a couple of years back called Healthy Mind, Fit Body.
Indeed.
Well, Wes, welcome back to Freedom Lovin'.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, it's been a few years, I think, since I was on your show.
You were on episode number 2, and we talked about breaking free, which was a great show to start off with. You were the first guest on the Freedom Lovin' podcast. So
yeah, I appreciate that. It's been a cool journey to listen to all your shows and your travels around the world and stuff.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. That Breaking Free was a series that I did on Complete Liberty, talking about the book, or actually reading it, Brandon's book about psychotherapy clients in group therapy, and going through a list of questions that are really important to ask oneself about one's childhood and how one was treated by one's parents.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things in that show. I re-listened to it yesterday just to remind myself so we don't overlap too much here, although there will be some overlap. But if you want to go back and listen to that, you can just look at freedomlovin.com, and it's episode number 2 in the podcast area. It was like 6 months ago or something that you released your book, and I was like, oh, I got to get him on the show. And then we talked about having you come on the show, and then what happened? Somehow here we are in December, and
months just fly by, don't they?
Months are flying by,
this planet keeps on spinning and rotating.
Yeah. So not much we can do about that, but it's great to finally talk about it. I really enjoyed the book, Complete Liberty Inside Out. And I thought it was like the next level from your first book, because I want to just give the listeners, kind of my trajectory here in learning philosophy. Your book the Complete Liberty book was kind of it broke the camel's back I was learning a lot about philosophy and what I really knew about politics, what my views were and everything. And that kind of laid out all the ideas of a voluntary society in a way that I couldn't dispute any of it. Once I finished listening to that book, I was like, yeah, I don't really have any more questions. Like, we can, living in a voluntary society is the ideal way to go,
Yeah. Yeah, it really is apparent once you start getting into the ideas of what politics is about, that there's not a whole lot of thought put into the process. As I start out in the first chapter talking about politics in midstream, and that's kind of what we hear when we turn on the radio, like to NPR. National Proletariat Radio, is it? Or Marxist Place. They have a segment on markets called Marxist Place.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, it's just so apparent that people are just philosophizing in midstream. They're not really checking the premises that are involved in this thing called politics and all the machinations of it. It's truly a dire situation that we have, because it's just this universalized foundation in our society of coercion and a punishment system to boot. So yeah, it's not so healthy for getting needs met.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I don't spend any time watching television or paying attention to mainstream media. I don't go on CNN.com or any of that. But there was an incident here that happened not too far from San Diego, a big shooting just last week. And so I went on to Reddit just to see, I read a little bit about what happened and was looking at the comments, and I'm amazed that people still just parrot back exactly what the pundits are saying in the media. There's no questioning it. I mean, very little questioning it. It's just sort of like, oh, this is what CNN said, so that's obviously exactly what happened. And there's no need to question any of it. It's like, oh, ISIS did it. That's it, period.
Yeah. It's all cut and dry. The stuff's been just kind of vetted by powers that don't really understand the nature of the matrix. So yeah, it's a toss-up between Fox News and CNN and whatever the other ones are. I mean, trying to figure out what the truth is difficult sometimes, because you know that they've got their party lines and definitely are just immersed in a system that is very difficult to discern what the principles are if you're not, used to really thinking in that way. So they just take for granted the situation that we have called the status matrix.
Yeah, The Matrix. So what was your motivation to write Complete Liberty Inside Out?
Yeah, well, it's basically a culmination of all the shows that I did subsequent to doing a series on nonviolent communication, which is the work by psychologist Marshall Rosenberg. And I came across that in 2010. So that was episode 126 when I did an intro to that. And then I went all the way up to episode 212. 213 to 221 are the audiobook chapters of the book. So I did nearly 100 episodes subsequent to encountering NVC, and I just wanted to integrate all those different facets that I talked about on the podcast into a book and just kind of like extrapolate on the nature of all these implications of complete liberty, what it means to actually live in a free society versus a statist one, one that demands things of us and punishes us if we don't do what's demanded. And then having this sense of inner liberation, too. That's another facet of it. The book is more about the psychology of complete liberty than the politics, per se.
Yeah, and that was something that we were, like, when you were out here in, like, 09, 2010, that kind of range, we were hanging out a lot and talking about the book that Stefan Molyneux wrote, Real-Time Relationships, which was kind of mind-blowing for a lot of people. And it really pushed things, I thought it really pushed things forward. And I think that our discussions around that, where I kind of learned a lot about philosophy and how to apply that to my own life. And then it was probably about maybe 6 months later or something, our friend Trevor gave me the book Nonviolent Communication. And I was like, oh, this looks pretty cool. And I read through it in like a day. And I was like, yeah, that was really good. And then I stuck it on my shelf for another 4 or 5 months. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. And then I reread it. And we were talking, I think, one time, and I'm like, you got to read this. It's amazing. It's like the real-time relationships on steroids.
Yeah, I remember that phrase.
Yeah.
It's like RTR on steroids.
Yeah.
So yeah, the jargon, NVC is like RTR on steroids.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
How many people in society would recognize what that means, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, and then right around then, I think, is when you picked it up and kind of ran with it. And I think you've done a ton to get it out there. Like, it's amazing what happened after that, because then all of a sudden other podcasts I'm listening to are starting to talk about it, and people that I have no connection with other than, they have a kind of libertarian type of philosophy are talking about nonviolent communication. And so that was pretty cool to see. I mean, it's really proliferated out there. So yeah.
I've heard actually Adam Kokesh talked about it on Berwick's show, Anarchast. Yeah, so he's been kind of immersing himself in that. I'm not sure how much he's really studied it, but he's definitely talking about it and, noting that when we have empathetic, compassionate communication about needs, it's way more productive and constructive than just doing the enemy images thing and, making demands and name calling and all that stuff. So he did a video, actually, it was on YouTube, about an encounter he had with a guy that was in the military. A big dude. I think he weighed like 300 pounds or something. And Adam used a bit of NVC. It wasn't actually the typical way that Rosenberg would speak it. There's numerous workshops online you can watch the way he uses it. But he used it enough to actually defuse the situation and end up shaking hands with the guy, I think. So, yeah, it helped a bunch. He was in the military too, and he extracted himself from there and was really looking for ways to promote this message of freedom. And I think he's got a book out now called Freedom. And I appreciate the fact that he's got it in the public domain, freely to download in audiobook and print edition formats, which mine is too. I spent chapter 6 of Complete Liberty refuting the notion of intellectual property, so-called. So, it's basically just giving credit where credit is due in the marketplace and allowing, users or consumers to do what they want, basically.
That's a fascinating chapter too, because they're even among people that are kind of hardcore libertarians, that's a controversial topic, but that part of Complete Liberty was, I think, is one of the best parts because it's so clear cut. There's no, again, for me, there was no other argument to it. It's like, okay, I get it. It doesn't need to exist. And that's what happens with a lot of things. Now, with the new book, who is it geared towards? Like you're kind of blending the idea of liberty with like NVC and getting to feelings and needs and things like that. So, but who are you actually writing the book towards?
Well, let's see. I guess any human being who really is dissatisfied with what they've been told and the typical messages in our culture, so it could be anybody in that regard.
Yeah.
A lot of people are really disconnected from their internal world or dissociated from a lot of things that would otherwise meet their need for authenticity. So it is going to be a little bit foreign to folks who are just really immersed in the way the Matrix is, basically. I'm not sure NPR listeners would be that receptive to it. Although, I do try to build a lot of bridges in this book. There really isn't the moralistic judgment that's present in Complete Liberty, talking about how government is immoral, as a construct and as an organization of people that are making demands and punishing people and so forth. So I know that there's lots of libertarian arguments in a moral way. And, by the way, Molyneux used those arguments in his books as well. So Ayn Rand is kind of the moralistic philosopher par excellence. And that's where a lot of libertarians get that rhetoric to say this is right and they're obviously wrong. And so then what? Things don't really change when you use moralistic judgment. And it can, I guess, sort of feel good to do that, to a sense of moral righteousness in a sense, but it doesn't build any bridges. So with this book, I wanted to build some bridges of empathy into the psyche so people can understand comprehensively the nature of themselves, others, and the society we live in. It's subtitled Honoring Yourself and Others for Optimal Enrichment. So I really wanted to address all the facets that we typically aren't taught if we go to school or if we grew up in a religious family or just a parenting system in which many needs are not really recognized or met.
So how do we achieve mental freedom?
Yeah, this is part of a chapter in my book, and I wanted to kind of start out with what mental freedom is in brief, because the chapter is titled The Unseen Internal World, and it's about knowing thyself, So mental freedom, we don't get a clear picture of that from psychology textbooks, unfortunately. I would say there's, again, that interaction between philosophy and psychology in this realm inside of our minds, because the ideas that we have tend to drive, the beliefs that we have, the traditions that we indulge in, the things that we do. So how do we get freedom in this realm? What does freedom actually mean within the mind? It's a complex subject, obviously, but I wanted to distill it down to what I see are the components of it, which is, on the philosophical side, ferreting out the various contradictions that one might have in one's philosophy. Now, most people don't have their philosophy sketched out, let alone be able to deliver it standing on one foot, as Ayn Rand did, right?
Yeah.
So if you study objectivism, there's a book by Leonard Peikoff called Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. And I think those philosophical principles are really, really helpful for kind of having this comprehensive overview of what philosophy is, from metaphysics, which is the nature of reality, to epistemology, the nature of knowledge, how do we acquire knowledge, what is true and what is false, how do we determine that, to ethics, and to politics, which is how we deal with other people. She saw ethics as how we deal with ourselves, and then aesthetics, the nature of beauty and art and all that. So that comprehensive vision enables us to ferret out the contradictions about the ideas that we've been given in our culture or adopted. So I think if we really address the contradictions, then we can think in a non-contradictory way, shall we say, a logical way, so that we're acting in service to our lives and well-being. And that segues into dealing with the fact that we probably have some defense mechanisms that we generated from the trauma that we were subjected to in childhood. How do we cope with having these adverse experiences as children?
Right.
Experiences of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect even. These kinds of things can traumatize us because we're overpowered. We have no way to really help ourselves in that process because we are depending on our caregivers for our lives. So this idea of our mortality comes up as well. And as biological entities, we gravitate to pleasure and we seek to avoid pain. So what defenses do we have in our minds that get triggered whenever we encounter new arguments or new experiences and all these things? So the more we are able to, deal with these defenses in an accepting, empathetic, and compassionate way, the better we're going to be able to actually diffuse them and get to the need for authenticity, to meet this need on a more consistent basis, so that we're not involved in like roles and doing duties. This is my duty as this particular person with this particular job, but actually we're able to use our volitional capacity to make choices and to own those choices. So to take responsibility, that's one of the things I deal with in the second chapter about self-responsibility and how we can surrender it and how we can empower ourselves. When we look at the capacity that we have to be architects of our own lives,
Right.
like Daniel said that, only you are in charge of your happiness. Like that's the huge responsibility that we have, is we can increase our happiness. We are in charge of how we fulfill ourselves.
Yeah.
So this is a huge responsibility. And the more we're able to free ourselves from notions that do damage to self-responsibility, the better we're going to be able to take care of ourselves and to hopefully connect with others in win-win ways.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of encompasses everything in terms of happiness and fulfillment. And when I think of it, when I hear it, I think of like starting a new business or starting a new project and having that ability to be free to do it and not be constrained by what you think you should do or what you think you can't do and these kind of things. So that's where, I see that as kind of a starting point that you need to get to. And then you can start, like I talk about building freedom in your life. And if you don't have that ability to be mentally free, it's really, really hard to build freedom because you have a lot of constraints already in your mind. So.
Yeah. And if you look at nonviolent communications, 4Ds, they call it, which are this life alienating communication that Rosenberg noticed that is so prevalent in our culture, the domination sort of thinking. So I go through this in the chapter on nonviolent communication as well, but just quickly diagnosing, the labeling is disabling process.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever we categorize ourselves or other people with these confining terms, we end up sacrificing more freedom for ourselves and for others. And then the demand-oriented thinking, that somehow we can't trust ourselves or others to compassionately give. We have to make demands. This is the thought process.
Yeah.
We have to threaten somebody or threaten ourselves. The inner critic can loom really large as, basically the thing that came from our childhoods, the thing that we heard, the voice of our parents that got integrated, internalized within us. So that gets into the shaming and blaming process. And it also leads to the punishment process as well when demands are made. And then there's deserve-oriented thinking.
Yeah.
Which leads to punishment and rewards too. You're a good person, you deserve this. You're a bad person, you deserve this. And then, of course, the denial of responsibility, which gets back to the nature of self-responsibility. Whenever we disempower ourselves from our own agency, we're really doing a disservice to ourselves and to others, because others need to be given a model. Children especially need to be given a model of what this self-empowerment and self-responsibility process entails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you talked about the idea of surrendering to systems of domination. And I thought that was interesting. Like, how does that work in society? How do people surrender to systems of domination?
Yeah, that's a whole topic unto itself, isn't it? Because, there are various systems, and the ones that I can decipher, the ones I address in the book, are basically the parenting system, the religious system, the schooling system, and the status system. Like all these systems tend to use power over strategies to get some needs met, even though those needs aren't really recognized and made explicit,
Right.
So the nature of surrendering to a system of domination is pretty complex because it starts so early in our lives. We do it before we even know we're doing it, essentially. Mm-hmm. Whenever a parent in a stern voice tells us not to do something or to do something and threatens us with punishment or love withdrawal, that is the first, the beginnings of the surrender process. Conforming to the desires, wishes, or demands of another person is how we end up surrendering our need for autonomy and independence and choice and respect, So this transitions from parenting pretty readily into schooling, because schooling is just kind of an extension of this parental punishment-oriented or authoritarian-oriented process. And even if the school doesn't use overt punishments, it's still entreating children and students from an extrinsic motivated perspective rather than an intrinsic one. So the nature of intrinsic motivation is really key to not surrendering to a system of domination where we're actually able to get our needs met under our own volition, like what we really want to do. And not many people get to do what they really want to do in this culture, unfortunately, because of these ways of interacting with people that go back back to tribal society, where people were conforming to be in the tribe. Otherwise, they're going to be cast out or something horrendous happens to them,
Yeah. That's why it's complete liberty inside out, right? You start inside, because before it was like, well, how can we fix this system that's horrendously unfree and make it better, make it moral? But when you start with the internal, with the intrinsic stuff, then it becomes a whole different thing. And then we talk about things that we actually can control, which is something that I focused on in this podcast. Like, what can we actually control with our freedom levels? Like, what is it that we can do? And starting with what happened in your past and starting with things that you can actually change within yourself is a great place, right? I mean, that's what your happiness counseling is about.
Yeah. Individual autonomy. The fact that no one can think our thoughts for us or feel our feelings, regardless of how connected we are to other people or how many connection needs we're getting met. We still are independent entities. And I know there are biological instances of, people joined at the hip or having one body and two heads. That's actually happened.
Yeah.
I saw a film recently, my friend sent me, of this guy who was born without any arms and legs.
Wow.
So essentially dependent on another person for sheer survival for his whole life, essentially. Wow. So beside instances of that, we still can provide for ourselves in many ways. And, there's three types of independence in this regard: financial independence, intellectual independence, and psychological independence. So if we can strive for more and more independence, it's going to help us relate to others in a win-win way, rather than, demanding that they sacrifice things for us or sacrificing ourselves for someone else. And I think that's one of the keys to what Marshall Rosenberg portrayed, is that we don't need to sacrifice needs. We can engage in win-win, mutually beneficial interactions, which is the same thing that Ayn Rand said, which is kind of ironic because, she was steeped in moralistic judgment and philosophy,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this idea of sacrifice, it's interesting because how many conversations have you had with people where they are putting the idea of sacrifice as something noble, and it's so hard to have a conversation where you're looking at it like sacrifice is not something that's beneficial to either party. It's like you can say, I'm going to sacrifice for my kids. A lot of people say that. I sacrifice for my kids. Why is that not, in your opinion, how you're looking at it, why is that not a beneficial thing to do?
Well, I guess it gets down to defining the term, right? And Ayn Rand did that pretty eloquently. She said that a sacrifice means trading a higher value for a lesser value or no value.
Yeah.
And when we look at it that way, then of course sacrifice would not be helpful for anyone. But I think a lot of people use the term in ambiguous ways, and I address that in the book and the chapter about ethics. Mm-hmm. So trying to understand a non-sacrificial ethics, I think, is one of the main goals for humanity, regardless of whether it's on the radar or not. Because so long as we have a cultural system that's oriented towards sacrifice and all these other systems, then we're not going to get needs met. It's going to be, kind of a race to the bottom, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, it is. Now, one thing that I think it goes to the heart of your book and kind of what you've been talking about for the last few years is the idea of childhood trauma. And it's kind of, I was thinking about the questions I wanted to ask you today, and I'm like, my show is about freedom. So I guess as far as childhood trauma, what does that have to do with our freedom levels and our fulfillment and happiness?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a monster of a question, because I did a show with Brett Venat, School Sucks podcast, with my friend Matt, who was with me on a 4-part series I did on Complete Liberty, talking about childhood trauma. With Brett, we did a 5-part series, and we kind of addressed a lot of the same things because it is such an important topic in the realm of human integration, healing, and growing, essentially. Because there's a view that we all get these wounds in childhood, and then later on when we mature, if we're not focusing on the nature of those wounds, we can end up reliving the traumas, reliving these wounds, re-wounding ourselves, essentially. as we go through life, so the whole spectrum of addictions is an example, not treating ourselves with kindness, not treating others with kindness. So to the extent that we weren't treated with kindness in our childhood and our needs were sacrificed, we did suffer various adverse childhood experiences, as they say. There's a survey that was done in San Diego a few years back by Kaiser Permanente, and there's another organization, I think it was a university, that did it. They collaborated and they did a survey with people that had, I guess, dropped out of a weight loss clinic or process, and they determined that one of the main factors was whether or not people had adverse childhood experiences. So like a divorce, children experience divorce, or alcoholism, or a parent in jail, or fighting, not getting emotional nurturance, basically being yelled at, physical violence. And of course, the prevalence of spanking is like around 90% in American culture.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's going to be going down as people get more and more information about how sacrificial that process is, and how detrimental it is to the quality of the relationship that we have with children. And so, looking at childhood trauma just entails reflecting a lot on the nature of the needs that didn't get met when one was a child, and then basically getting an orientation of reparenting yourself. So looking at your self as composed of parts, essentially, the child self, the teenage self, and your true self or sage self, as Nathaniel Brennan pointed out. I think those are the main parts of our psyche because we have a history there. There's experiences that we had as we progressed through childhood, through our teenage years, and into adulthood, So how do we reflect on these parts? How do we manage them? How do we enable true self-leadership? This is all really important stuff in the realm of psychology. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of focus on it. I mean, I went through a psychology program in college and master's degree and so forth, and there wasn't like a spotlight put on this stuff. There wasn't an emphasis. I think if there had been, then it would start to unravel the fabric of the matrix that people live in, right? Because there's, politics is involved in everything practically, and these systems of domination are involved in a lot of things as well. So it would require a lot of needs-based judgment in this regard, and that can be uncomfortable, upsetting. It can cause conflict, and humans are really adept at avoiding these things, even though they end up reliving a lot of trauma and engaging in conflict all the time,
Right. So when people are seeking out more freedom, what I've noticed is that a lot of times what they're doing, their motivations for doing it are sort of to try to heal their childhoods. And I wonder if we had a world where more people were kind of connected, a little bit more connected, that we could have, like, for example, so on Tim Ferriss's show, he talks a lot about this idea of, like, he said he's worried about if I drop my edge, whatever this is that's driving me, that I'm angry about or that I'm upset about, then I won't accomplish as much. What do you think about that idea? Yeah, what do you think about that idea? It's like, if I get really, if I go into my childhood and I kind of heal all this stuff, then I'm going to be like too soft and I won't be able to excel in business or something.
I'll be lost in meditation.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be too zenned out, right?
Sitting on a pillow and, thinking thoughts of compassion for others. Yeah, so I guess maybe he fears that there's some loss of ambition that could happen if he gets more connected with, this healing and growing side of himself. And I think he's been striving to get more clarity on some things, but the focus hasn't been necessarily on healing childhood trauma, has it? Or on clear philosophical principles. I mean, the philosophy and the psychology of liberty have this interplay with each other, and, the non-sacrificial ethics segues into psychology. Like, how do we live in a way that gets our needs met and doesn't sacrifice the needs of others too? Yeah. So I think that you can still get your need for creativity and expression and all that met while actually practicing inner compassion and empathy with others. There doesn't need to be a dichotomy there, an either or scenario.
Right.
So I think if you were to look at, he's talked to Kevin Rose. I heard the conversation they had once, I think when he just started his podcast, talking about going to therapy. And I think he went once and he had a great time, but he didn't go back. Yeah. So I think that this inner journey can take all kinds of different manifestations, right? We can go into therapy, we can do self-therapy, I really recommend Nathaniel Brandon's sentence completion exercises as a way to delve deeper into our own subconscious processes. It's kind of like this pathway that opens up to a realm of thinking that's just below the conscious level or on the periphery of our awareness. This is where the emotions come from too. And I think that self-therapy process is really helpful. So,
Yeah.
as well as getting involved in like nonviolent communication groups, compassionate discussions about needs. That's really helpful and enriching for people to start healing because, on the philosophical side, there is a need for clarity in the realm of the principles because we can do all the compassion work that is capable of us, but if we're not thinking clearly about the nature of the matrix or the ideas that are dominating our society, then we can fall prey to them or we can be really blindsided by them.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, let's talk about NVC a little bit more because that's a big part of your book as well. And where do you think it fits in terms of, kind of winning over more freedom in your life?
Yeah, originally when I did the series, I saw this as an amazing way to connect with others, to build bridges of empathy so that we can finally get some needs met in the realm of freedom, Because activism typically has consisted of either playing politics, which is really siding with, if you can't beat them, join them, that kind of idea.
Yeah.
So if we run for office, we're now legitimizing the statist matrix. We're basically saying that, I want to be part of this too. Right. Even though ultimately, say, as an anarchist, I would not take office or I would abolish all the laws that I would have control of abolishing. But, that's really not going to lead to more enrichment for oneself because one will end up as being part of the system, sacrificing the principles that one had, to get into it in the first place.
Oh, come on, Wes. You don't think that Donald Trump is going to save the world?
Quite the opposite. I mean,
but that could be a whole podcast in itself.
He might put his foot in his mouth so many times before the election, people will think that he just can't hold that noble office, so-called, right? I mean, his latest thing against Muslims in general and maybe closing parts of the internet, it's just,
is that what
it's pure. Oh yeah. It's pure fascism.
Yeah.
What he's advocating. And it's an open question whether the American culture is going to side against the fascist ideas. The immigration stuff is another big issue as well. So
and side with the communist ideas instead.
Bernie Sanders, right?
Yeah.
It's like the two extremes. Yeah. And I've been doing a show with our mutual friend Chris Stefanik, Choice Conversations, and we're doing a multi-part series on the contradictions being offered over at Freedom in Radio, Stefan Molyneux's website and podcast, because there's been a lot of rhetoric over there that's been quite collectivistic in nature, which goes really against a lot of the founding principles of his show and programs and books,
Right.
So it's pretty disturbing to see that coming out of that place because it's supposedly about personal and political freedom, but not lately, for sure. But NVC, was something that really was transformative for me in terms of getting more connected to this explicit vocabulary of needs. And the Center for Nonviolent Communication has a page for feelings and a page for needs, and feelings arise from needs that are met and unmet, so there's different spectrums of emotions that come from whether or not we're getting our needs fulfilled. And this basic process of understanding the foundation of our psychology is really helpful for getting more free, essentially, like having more clarity and mastery over a domain which is really foggy and vague for the most part. In this culture, we're not taught these ideas. We're not really connected to the needs that are driving us,
Right.
As Rosenberg said, people who are in touch with their needs don't make very good slaves.
Right.
So I think NVC can really be a helpful guide in this culture where we can make needs-based judgments instead of moralistic judgments that are based on right, wrong, and, impugn somebody's self-worth or even our own, saying I'm no good or I'm bad or something like that, which becomes self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately.
Yeah. And how about in terms of, like you talked about how politics doesn't work, it's not something that we're going to be able to change and make people more free through politics. So on what I saw with NBC is it's a much more one-on-one kind of basis where you may not be able to have millions of people vote in some direction, but you can talk to someone, give them empathy, and have them understand you, right? That's kind of the basis of NVC. And what do you think about just in terms of relationships, how that works?
Yeah, and vice versa too. You can understand someone else too
Right.
in such a more clear and helpful way if you just get down to those fundamentals. Because, our consciousness consists of, a lot of thoughts and a lot of memories, a lot of judgments, unfortunately, the way that we're encouraged to speak in our culture and to think about ourselves. The shaming and the blaming, goes hand in hand with moralizing. So when we strip all that stuff away, the domination culture, the domination thinking and language, we just get down to matters of the heart, feelings and needs. And with these, we can build bridges because needs are universal and feelings are universal. Everyone has them. So as Rosenberg also said, don't mind or pay attention to what someone thinks, you'll live longer.
Mm-hmm.
Because the process of thinking, unfortunately, is so enveloped in this moralistic perspective that it's really difficult to discern needs sometimes when we're feeling triggered about what someone has said,
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And it just brings it to, for me, like I think of relationships and how much easier it is now even just knowing a little bit of NVC and understanding this idea of empathy, it kind of transformed how I viewed relationships. And you kind of forget about all that us versus them, or I'm against this person or this group of people, because you can cultivate that empathy. And that right there is a huge difference that I see. And I did a show last week. I had Stephen Nash on the show, and we talked a little bit about dating and relationships. And that's something that NVC, I think it's a huge tool that you can use that's going to make all the difference, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, who does not want to be related to in a compassionate way, or an empathetic way, or an accepting way?
Yeah.
I think deep down everyone does. I mean, some people might have a lot of defenses that prevent that sort of open pathway to their heart, so they could be on guard. They could be just really dissociated from the suffering that they're experiencing, because there's a lot of suffering in life just as a biological process. We are all on this conveyor belt to oblivion, basically. And we need to raise our awareness about this to maximize our potential in this life. This is the only life that matters, because this is the one in which we have a consciousness. We survive and flourish. And so the more we can focus on the nature of our mortality in this cosmos and really get down to these basic internal processes of feelings and needs, the better we're going to be able to relate to each other, I mean, there's just so much stuff going on in midstream in our culture that it takes a bit of, focus and mindfulness, raising our consciousness, practice of living consciously. Nathaniel Brannan's 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem really are helpful in this process, instrumental to attuning to what really matters. And then we can start feeling more resourceful to deal with potential conflicts and bringing up issues and challenging various views that, have been accepted for better or worse in this culture.
Right. So knowing NVC now, do you think it's still worth it to strive for more political freedom, like going to the out, because we're talking about inside and now out, the idea of political freedom. Do you think that's still important to strive for when we could spend, pretty much a lifetime working on the internal stuff, right?
Yeah, there is just so much enrichment to be had in this internal world. And I really appreciated the movie by Pixar, I think it was, Inside Out, that just came out this year.
Great movie.
Yeah, actually, I didn't copyright Inside Out, so I guess they they didn't steal it from me. But I think that would be an amazing series of films if they just keep on going in that realm and start pointing out these elephants in the room that we're all familiar with once they're pointed out, when they're made a topic. Just the nature of the domination thinking and the power over strategies that are used constantly. And the punishment model is just looming large in our lives all the time with laws and jail cells and prisons and just a lot of stuff that is frightening and disorienting and sad, really, really tragic stuff. So the more we can attune to that, the more enrichment we can get in our lives, at least within our sphere of control and influence. So yeah, when I wrote Complete Liberty, the 10th chapter is dedicated to this free state project. I'm in New Hampshire right now, actually, the so-called live free or die state. That's the motto on the license plates, ironically enough. Because, when I first got here in '06, '07, I did a little recon mission, and I got my license plates, right? Otherwise, I would not be able to drive around. I would probably get imprisoned. Who knows what would happen if I didn't have license plates, right?
Yeah.
So I get these things put on my truck, and they said I have 10 days to get a sticker on my windshield, which is like the safety inspection. It's not even for emissions. You can kind of think that California has the emissions standards, and whether or not those are based on rationality, probably not so much in many cases.
Yeah.
But because I think they exempt the really older vehicles that burn horribly, their oil and stuff.
Right.
But nonetheless, you're forced to do this to get one of these stickers. And I had 10 days to get it. And the first week I was driving around with my new plates, going to get a safety inspection in the next couple of days. I get pulled over by a cop, right? Or I pull myself over lest I be harmed if I didn't, right?
Right. Exactly.
It was right by my apartment. And I just was flabbergasted as to why I got pulled over. And he went back to his car and, of course, searched my record to see if I had any outstanding warrants and all that, which they tend to do. They try to find pretty much anything that they can get you on to arrest you, to charge you with fines and so forth. And he comes back to the window and says, you need to get a safety sticker on your windshield. And I was like, well, tell me something I don't know. So, this is just a small example of the nature of statism. It's definitely not a live free or die sort of perspective here. There's just a lot of compliance, a lot of just giving in, sitting on needs in a culture that's punishment oriented.
Yeah.
So my thoughts on Free State Project now are similar to what they were back then. It's just that I know more about childhood trauma and its devastating effects, as well as the nonviolent communication process. I just know that these things are not made a priority by the folks that are involved in the project, let alone the people in the community. And so long as those traumatic experiences go unhealed in the individuals that are wanting freedom, then we're not going to really get much freedom. And there are probably more people involved in the political process in this liberty movement than existed almost 10 years ago, 8 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, the project's been going on since 2003, I believe. That's when New Hampshire was chosen as a state to move 20,000 people, liberty lovers, to actually affect some sort of change where we have economic freedom and political freedom. Unfortunately, the mission statement is not really voluntarist. And I point this out in Complete Liberty, too, that there's inherent contradictions and just not clarifying the nature of what freedom is. And so this is really hindering the progress as well, because we need to make these ideas open, clearly spoken, and just delineate what the principles are so that people can hear what they are at least. And then if they want to argue those principles, then we can go from there and hopefully understand where they're coming from. There's a lot of fear of adopting the freedom ideas,
Yeah.
If we've been living in an unfree world a whole lot of the time, it's really uncomfortable to think about the change process.
Yeah, exactly. And you've lived in a few different parts of the U.S. Have you seen anything that looks a little more free than other places, or is it, in your view, is it pretty much the same thing that we're dealing with?
Yeah, we've had discussions about this, haven't we? Yeah, anywhere you go, you're going to run into these so-called laws and the statist system that's trying to impose things, or else, So I think you just have to build the freedom where it is in your own mind and in the relationships you have with other people, and hope that this stuff gets widely disseminated, widely distributed. Freedom is already here. It's just not widely distributed yet, to paraphrase somebody else in the tech community that said that, I think.
Yeah. So where do you derive your hope from? Hope and change?
Definitely not Obama. It was funny. I listened to Duncan Trussell interview Mark Maron, I think his name is.
Yeah.
He's one of the only podcaster that has interviewed the so-called President of the United States, right?
I listened to that one as well.
Did you?
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you think of it?
Interesting. Yeah, it's amazing how I think people kind of, no matter what their opinion is, once somebody like that kind of a public figure is in front of them, they sort of like melt, and it's just, it's like they forgot what to say, and it's like it's not really a human being there.
Yeah, I think Duncan was saying that he would not be able to articulate the things that he was articulating to Mark in the show that they did. I didn't
Yeah.
listen to his interview with Obama though, so I don't know how it went. I guess a lot of people liked it that didn't suspect they would like it, but he did note that, when a politician is in that role, they're not really being real in the
Hmm.
way that the average person would be real.
Yeah.
They have a role to play, and so they kind of structure their answers based on what they want you to hear rather than what you ask them,
Hmm.
you know? So there's not much hope in the realm of people playing roles, especially
Yeah.
politicians,
Yeah.
because that is not meeting the need for authenticity. And it's involving oneself in a system that is based on domination thinking and punishments. The idea of a law in a statist society is, as Mark Stevens, the host of the No State Project, says, it's an opinion backed by a gun.
Hmm.
So if you don't follow that opinion, then what happens?
Yeah.
I think that we'll get my sense of hope is, yeah, that these ideas become more widely distributed as a result of the internet, people downloading podcasts. I don't know. There's probably not been as much adoption of podcast listening as we would like. It's just not really mainstream yet.
Yeah.
I just ask people at random whether they listen to podcasts, and they kind of give me a blank stare most of the time.
Right.
But, some of the radio stations like NPR are putting out podcast information. So hopefully we get more people listening to that stuff and integrating these ideas, and gradually things will change. However, I kind of lost some optimism in this process because of the nature of childhood trauma and how it is really difficult to focus on. It's not
Hmm.
easy. If it were easy, everyone would have done it, and we'd already have freedom. Like you say, when you read the Ideas in Complete Liberty, it made sense. Common sense tends to win. Logic is pretty indisputable there. So why doesn't everybody adopt that?
Right.
Why is it not widely distributed? This is an interesting thing to think about, because it seems like most people just don't have the intrinsic motivation to really, the curiosity to really explore this stuff, to ferret out the contradictions, and to have a new vision for themselves.
Yeah.
Because this is really about creating a new vision for oneself and for society. And, it's just not really on people's radar. Basically, they're just trying to make ends meet for the most part, and find various ways to cope with what they've been experiencing.
Yeah.
Sports and different things to do, traveling, and all this stuff can take our attention away from the things that really can move our lives forward, that really enrich our lives if we focused on it. So my hope, I guess, long term is that I think it's inevitability, actually, the nature of artificial intelligence development.
Right.
And I have a friend, Peter, in Los Angeles, who runs a company that was talked about in James Barrett's book, Our Final Invention, which is an interesting book to read. I recommend it to get an overview of the nature of AI and where it's going to lead us. It's pretty much an inevitability unless we self-destruct before we create it.
Yeah.
But once it's created, I think that there's a possibility, I don't know if it's probable, but there's a possibility that it could assist in this process of interconnection, so that, people are using smartphones. Imagine a smartphone that actually had an AI system that you could talk to,
Yeah.
right? That would talk to you, that would monitor all of your biorhythms and be able to guess or to understand what you're feeling and needing.
Yeah. That would be
And
so amazing.
yeah, it really would. Sort of an empathetic voice that's with you, that it tends to be you because it knows all of your choices for the most part.
Unfortunately, then the problem is everyone else is going to have that information and use it against you, right? I mean, if it's on a phone, then it's probably free access to all the usual suspects like the NSA.
Yeah, there's all that, the surveillance state. I always thought that so long as government exists, we can't really have all of this advanced technology. It's going to be used nefarious ways, right?
Well, what about, so like I kind of have a little bit of hope. I don't think it's like some major thing, but things have changed for the better in many ways. And I had Kevin G on the show a couple months back, and we talked about,
I think I listened to that one.
yeah, radical optimism. And there's some things that there's some things that are happening in the world that are getting better. And then you look at just locally, like what's going on, and you see things like the marijuana laws are changing. I mean, that's happening at a pretty fast rate for as far as laws go. And yeah, it's definitely not perfect, and there's still going to be all sorts of regulation and taxes and all
Yeah.
that. But it's changed. I mean, 30 years ago, this was like I was thinking about someone, I think it was a Duncan Trussell podcast. They were talking about how back when we were kids, it was unheard of that they would ever legalize marijuana. I mean, it was a joke. It was like that's not never going to happen. And now here we are, and it's almost a joke that it's still illegal in places.
It really is. It's such a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider the fact that, and I don't do drugs, but if you were to do marijuana, you would have to, the only way you can die from it is if like 1,000 pounds of it is dropped on you.
Right.
You really can't die
Yeah.
through smoking it. Versus alcohol, which is socially sanctioned and
Yeah.
is sold here in New Hampshire by the government. You know,
Right.
we want to keep those who are enslaved, very well medicated, essentially. And it
Yeah.
seems like the psychedelics, the hallucinogens, the ones that kind of take your mind away from the ordinary way of thinking and tragic ways of acting, these are declared illegal,
Right.
So there's thoughts of conspiracy theories about this, but it's just really kind of, I kind of see it as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, in terms of this process. I know that there is some social trends that are going on in the direction of more freedom, but it seems to be always in the context of the status matrix, the matrix of regulations. There's no sort of statements that we can't have a system called government anymore. It is not meeting people's needs. It is sacrificing them on a daily basis. You just don't hear that clear sort of communication in our culture.
Right.
People just assume that we're going to have taxes. They assume that we're going to have regulations. Why would we not want to have those?
Right. Right.
There's not even a question about it.
No, it doesn't get questioned.
So all the intellectuals, including, the ones that are actually, in the public eye for the most part, tend not to be clear about this stuff. They tend not to adopt these principles that are going to bring us to a free world. And Larkin Rose actually is doing one of his projects where he's writing to the top, I think, 100 political science professors in America, at the hallowed halls of Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford, and go on down the list. I don't know. He probably has them on his website, larkinrose.com. But he just asked them, I think, like 5 questions about these contradictions about government, essentially. Like, can you delegate a right that you don't have?
Yeah.
I think that might be one of the questions. But it's very telling that he's not getting really any responses. You
Right.
got one from, I think, Michael Humer, who is an actual anarchist professor. I think he's teaching in Colorado.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. He actually wrote a book about basically the contradiction about government. So,
Wow.
You just don't see it in the mainstream, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so long as we don't see it in the mainstream, it's not going to be really implemented or taken seriously. And then we're going to suffer some serious economic consequences as a result of lack of clear thinking about these principles. So I would say, find hope in your own process of healing and growing so that you can enrich your life with the people that you really care about, and do the things that you really want to do and still be able to connect with people, for example, customers, by running a business in this semi-free, semi-enslaved marketplace.
Yeah.
The internet is offering a whole bunch of opportunities to create wealth, essentially. And with the rise of Bitcoin, that can enable creating wealth without so much of the horrendous downsides of the fiat currency system.
So there is hope. We have hope.
I guess we have some hope. There is a need. We have a need for hope. So to say that that need cannot get met puts us in quite a bind, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because, pessimism is pretty rampant, and when we fall into the pitfall of pessimism, we can get depressed. We can get even suicidal. Just lose all hope. And people that commit suicide have lost all hope, essentially, haven't they?
Exactly.
Yeah. I've had a few friends commit suicide, one from high school and one later on who was an advocate of Ayn Rand's ideas, objectivism.
Mm-hmm.
And objectivism says that happiness is your highest moral purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he had lost all hope at that point.
Yeah.
Took his own life. He lost his job and then he lost his dog and he lost a wife years prior to that I don't think he really healed the pain over. So this is why it's really important to look within and have compassion for these parts that are filled with pain and conflict and confusion and fear and sadness and so forth,
Yeah, and then you look at we talk about the Duncan Trussell Family Hour and talking about we're spinning around this planet and in this galaxy that's like, I mean, you just think about all this like really big stuff like that, and it's much easier to have some hope and to really be excited about the future and what's happening, what's going to happen, and things like that.
Yeah, it lifts the spirits, to see the big picture, to see the perspective of, wow, just the nature of how lucky we are to be living and breathing on this planet.
Exactly.
And in the book, I give a link to Jason Silva's videos, Shots of Awe, which I think are aligned with that sort of inspiration.
That's right.
And there's another link I give to Jim and Jory Mansky's page about the Pathways of Liberation, talking about moving from a state of basically being unconsciously incompetent to unconsciously competent.
Right.
So as we learn this vocabulary of feelings and needs and how to connect, we basically integrate it and automatize it so that it becomes essentially a fluent language for us.
Yeah. Awesome stuff, man. This has been really cool having you again on the show, and I think we could go on
it's been fun.
Yeah, we can go on for probably hours with this stuff, and there's a lot more that we could get into, so maybe we'll have you back sometime soon. It would be really cool. But in the meantime, definitely pick up Wes's book, Complete Liberty Inside Out, and you can get it at CompleteLiberty.com. Is that right?
Yeah, it's on the page there. I'm revamping the website, so hopefully I'll have it revamped by the time people get this. But yeah, you can download the print edition. Well, not the printed. You could print it out, I guess. You could download the ebook or PDF of it for free, as well as listen to the audiobook on the podcast, or you can get it from Audible or the Amazon Market, Kindle, and so forth, as well as a print edition if you want to buy that too. But yeah, chapter 4 actually is kind of a microcosm of the entire book. It's sort of summarizes the gist of it all, basic truths. So chapter 3 of the book, titled Childhood Trauma Revealed in Family, Religion, and Government. Mm-hmm. And in that one, I go through Nathaniel Brannan's list of questions about how you were reared in your childhood. And I think that is kind of like a synopsis of the book itself. Cover a lot of ground in chapter 3.
Cool.
But yeah, lots of things to explore there. And I want to make it available on the website too. So you don't have to download the entire book. If you want to, link to a particular chapter or section, that can be done as well.
Yeah. Cool. And Bitcoins are accepted on CompleteLiberty.com.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. It's basically a segue into a freer financial system. So let's hope it happens sooner rather than later.
Let's hope. Let's keep hope alive, man.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me on, Kev. This is really fun talking about these ideas that are near and dear to both of us and to all the people that are listening to Freedom Loving Podcast.
All right. Thanks for coming on. And good luck with everything. And we'll be talking soon.
You're most welcome.
Cheers.
All right.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Freedom Lovin' Podcast. To break free today, head on over to freedomlovin.com and download our free guide. 7 practical tips to living free in an unfree world.